If you want to build a globe-spanning empire, you don't start with an invading army. You start with pieces of paper, a handful of covert operatives, and a massive supply of crude oil. By 1991, the United States had reached a position of unchallenged influence. But unlike Rome or Britain, America didn't plant a flag and claim ownership of the territories it absorbed. It built a system so quiet and pervasive that most of the world didn't even realize they were living inside an empire. Welcome back to Post Facto. In Act 4 of our Pax Americana series, we're looking at the bipolar standoff of the Cold War from 1945 to 1991. While conventional history frames this era as a contest of nuclear stockpiles and proxy wars, the United States actually secured its victory by engineering 3 specific pillars to control the flow of international trade and capital. The first pillar was erected before World War II even ended. In 1945, the untouched U.S. economy was responsible for roughly half of the entire world's output. That staggering leverage gave American delegates the authority to rewrite the rules of money at a New Hampshire resort called Bretton Woods. The U.S. dollar was anchored directly to a physical bar of gold, with the price fixed by the government at exactly $35 an ounce. From there, every other major currency, the pound, the franc, the yen, was forced to peg its value to the U.S. dollar. Because the dollar was the only currency directly convertible into gold, the United States effectively became the central bank for the rest of the world. To inject enough dollars into a devastated Europe to keep the system running, Washington launched the Marshall Plan in 1948. They provided $13 billion in financial assistance, but used a mechanism called tied aid. The money was conditional. European nations had to spend those billions strictly on American-made goods. This economic architecture created deep structural reliance on the United States. It proved that in the modern era, securing global dominance relies on commercial ubiquity and consumer dependence rather than military occupation. But an economic order that profitable requires a security apparatus to protect it. To contain Soviet influence and secure the markets they had just rebuilt, the U.S. required a physical military footprint of a scale never before attempted. In 1949, they formalized the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. As NATO's first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, summarized, the blunt strategic directive of the alliance was simple: keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. Rather than negotiating access during a crisis, Washington used status of forces agreements, special legal frameworks that allow a country to station its military in a host nation to act as an offshore balancer. They built hundreds of permanent installations across Europe and Asia, from Ramstein in Germany to Kadena in Japan. Beyond shielding allies from Soviet armor, this network provided a subsidized logistics infrastructure for American industry, guaranteeing physical access to the world's most critical regions. While Western Europe was managed through overt democratic alliances, the Third World required a different approach. Here, Washington relied on a third pillar, the gray zone of covert operations. A defining test came in 1951, when Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, decided to nationalize his country's oil assets. This directly threatened the profit margins of British and American petroleum corporations. Rather than sending in the Marines and risking a direct military confrontation with the Soviet Union, the CIA dispatched operatives to Tehran. Using strategic bribes and anti-communist propaganda, they manufactured these riots, creating the impression that Mossadegh was both unpopular and inept. Mossadegh was ousted and placed under house arrest. In his place, a pro-American autocrat, the Shah, assumed unchallenged power, ensuring that Western oil assets remained accessible. This operation became the blueprint, the shadowy symbiosis between state intelligence agencies and multinational corporations proved to be a highly effective method for protecting resource extraction and countering Soviet interests across the globe. By the late 1960s, this 3-pillar system started cracking under its own weight. To fund the Vietnam War and domestic programs, the U.S. was printing far more dollars than they had gold in the vault. Foreign nations realized this and started demanding their gold back, threatening a run on America's dwindling physical reserves. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon executed a maneuver known as the Nixon Shock. He unilaterally severed the link between the dollar and gold. The Bretton Woods system was dead, and the dollar was suddenly a fiat currency, backed by nothing but government decree. The situation turned dire 2 years later during the 1973 oil embargo. OPEC nations slashed production, sending crude prices soaring, and leaving Americans waiting in lines at gas stations. Washington desperately needed a new mechanism to stabilize the dollar's value. The solution arrived via a secret arrangement in 1974. The United States approached Saudi Arabia with a deal. The Saudi monarchy agreed to price all of its crude oil exports exclusively in US dollars and to invest their massive surplus revenues directly into US Treasury bonds. In exchange, the United States guaranteed military aid, hardware, and unquestioned national security protection for the Saudi royal family. This created the petrodollar. Because every nation needs oil, and oil could now only be bought with dollars, it guaranteed global demand for US currency. By recycling those dollars back into US debt, America could suddenly run massive budget deficits funded by the world. This petrodollar cycle provided an endless line of credit, allowing the United States to embark on a massive military buildup in the 1980s. The Soviet Union, hobbled by a rigid economy and falling commodity prices, simply could not spend enough to keep up. By 1991, the Soviet system collapsed. The bipolar era was over, leaving the United States as the undisputed, unipolar hegemon of the world. But history shows that systems built for a two-player game behave very differently when one side suddenly controls the entire board. How does a global hyperpower operate when the rival that kept its ambitions in check is completely removed? The hubris of that unipolar moment directly planted the seeds for the multipolar world we see today, a world where emerging economies are actively trying to dismantle the petrodollar system. We'll break down how they are doing it in Act 5. If you want to understand how the current global order is fracturing, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss it. Drop your thoughts on the legacy of the Cold War in the comments below.